actually, our program is going to draft nicely off of Jason's prior remarks about millennials. Our first panel is actually on millennials itself. Of course, as Jason alluded to, the largest generation in U.S. history, and one that we're already seeing important changes in how they behave, particularly in terms of when they're getting married and their delay in having kids. And those behavioral changes, of course, have important consequences to the U.S. housing market and raises a lot of issues, such as do they prefer to rent or buy? What types of homes are they looking for and what types of features, and will they eventually buy at the same pace as their older cohorts, and if so, when? More than half of our panel in an upcoming Zillow home price expectation survey of housing experts and industry analysts indicated that they expected the median age of the first-time home buyer to increase over the next decade. So if that actually comes to pass and we see the median home buyer right now, the median age of the home buyer is about 31 years old. If we do see that the age of the first-time home buyer increase, of course, that'll have an impact on the home ownership rate, which we would expect to decline. And that same panel of experts that we recently surveyed said they believed that the home ownership rate, currently just below 65%, would fall over the next 5 years. So the panel of experts do believe that the changes that we're seeing right now in millennials will have ripple effects into the broader housing market. So that's kind of their assessment of what's going to happen with the median age of the first-time home buyer and their assessment of what's going to happen with home ownership rates. But we wanted to find out what you folks in the audience thought as well. So we've got a couple questions which we wanted feedback from you on regarding the median age of the first-time home buyer and home ownership rates. So if you could take a moment to text responses just like you did to the first question to these two questions, which are also on a card that you have, that would be great. We'll be sharing these, your answers later on in the program. If you want to see them more real time, you can follow hashtag HousingFuture in order to see the results there as soon as they're tabulated. And right now, though, I do want to bring up the panel that we're going to have speak about these issues. So I'm delighted to have Catherine Rampell from the Washington Post moderate the panel. She's going to be joined by Tom Bizzuto, head of the Bizzuto Group, a major developer of multifamily developments here on the East Coast. He'll be joined by Molly Carmichael from the John Burns Real Estate Consulting Group, and Dowell Myers, professor at the University of Southern California. So I'll go ahead and bring up Catherine and her panel, and while there, we will also have a brief video introduction to the issue as well.
I rent because I've been trying to save money to buy a house with my partner.
I rent because financially it's a lot easier.
I actually bought my first house in 2004.
I think after a couple years after grad school I'll want to buy a home when I'm a little more financially stable.
Maybe in a year or so my lease runs out, might be ready to buy.
Renting's easier for me.
One day I'll probably find a family and settle down, so one day I'll probably want to buy a home, maybe in a suburb.
Prices are definitely getting further and further out of our range. I definitely see the long-term potential of owning a property, but I like the flexibility and the kind of non-commitment aspect of renting.
Things that I don't like about renting a house are that I don't get a lot of say over things in my garden, and also things like painting my walls that I can't do.
I would love the opportunity, certainly, to really customize a space.
And I also think that renting is kind of, you're not investing in anything, it's just money lost.
What I think about when purchasing a house is definitely the neighborhood that I'm in. I definitely do want children someday.
I think location's probably more important for me.
I just walk right down here to work. This is really nice. It's almost too short to bike or take the bus. It's, first world problems, I guess.
I definitely think affordability is it's a big factor, especially for me.
The main keyword that was important to me, for me, was location.
I think I would live in a city. I grew up in the suburbs and they're really boring.
Eventually, I kind of want to live in the suburbs. I am probably looking for more of a quieter place after, when I'm ready to settle down.
Like the best of both worlds.
I mean, if it's affordable, if it's the great location, if there's things to do, I would definitely be down to buy a home.
I feel like none of us really know where we are in our lives currently. We're really confused about where we're going to be in like 4 or 5 years.
I think our generation is really focused on getting what we want.
So we heard a lot about the economic explanations for declines in homeownership rates amongst young people. I did want to explore a little bit further some of these other alternate explanations, especially since a lot of them have gotten attention in the press, about preferences for not owning not only a home, but not owning a car, not owning a textbook, some of the other examples that we just heard. So Tom, I'd love to start with you and see if you've heard if you have heard from millennials themselves or analysts that you've talked with about how this attitude towards ownership may have changed or not.
Sure. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much. I'm a little overwhelmed by some of the experts here, and what I'll say is my database comes from the fact that we manage 45,000 apartment units, and I employ 1,000 or so people who I think are millennials. What I see, what I hear from these folks is that they treasure flexibility. And I think you've heard that from some of the commentaries on the screen. I think they've come out of, and again, we hesitate to generalize about an entire generation. I listened to some experts on this topic. They couldn't even define the age group we're talking about. I think like my generation, where we talk about, well, the hippies were, the 60s. Well, the hippies and the people who are not, ever going to buy a home today are maybe 10%, 15%, but they have great influence on the rest of the generations. We all wore long hair in the 60s, whether we were hippies or not. And so you're seeing today a great influence from this group who don't want to own, who may never own, who look at flexibility and being able to do what they want to do as being the most important thing in their lives.
Okay. Well, so Molly, spinning off of that, we've also seen very sharp increases in rents in the last few years, especially in a lot of the already expensive cities. I mean, to what extent might those patterns actually might be pushing young people away from renting because they've experienced these shocking increases year to year and maybe getting displaced as a result?
Well, so I think there's two parts to that, and I'll caveat that with, so a lot of the research that I actually do is we actually talk to, we send out a survey to over 1 million people who are out there looking actually and shopping for a home. So we're a nice contrast to home, because what we're looking at are things like why aren't they moving, why are they moving, and how will those kinds of things impact it. And so what we have found, and I'm going to touch a little bit on the prior question and then answer that question if you don't mind. So what we have found is that life stage has such a huge impact on whether or not they want to rent or to own. And so because of the fact that we see so many millennials actually getting married later, average age between 25 and 30 is about 26, and interestingly enough, the average age for children for that group is about a year younger. But because the marriage and child thing is actually moving, we are seeing a lot more rent because they want the flexibility. They want to be closer to, frankly, the social environments and all of those things. And certainly employment has a lot to do with that, and income has to do with that. So as I go to answer that next question as it relates to rents, I think it has a lot to do with, can they afford to buy to begin with, right? So it puts more pressure on them to actually say, look, I'm spending this much money every month. Am I better off to be able to control that rent from not going up? Am I also better off to get something back for the biggest payment I'm going to make every month? And so it's about equity, and it is about being able to control that rent longer term. But I think there's just simply a portion of those millennials that don't have that opportunity, which is why we see a pretty large proportion, and it's going up dramatically, of even the 30 to 35-year-olds that are actually living at home with mom and dad, as well as the 20 to 30-year-olds.
How scarring do you think the housing bust was? I mean, having seen maybe a few people a few years older having lost their homes and that sort of thing.
It's interesting because it was actually most scarring actually for Gen X and not the millennials. And I know this panel is on millennials, but the percentage of home ownership that's actually gone down for the 35 to 39-year-olds was actually 7%, and actually 25 to 29-year-olds is actually a smaller percentage. It's closer to 3%. But it's also in relationship to how many actually owned prior, right? So I think and I also want to note, I think that the millennials, and we gauge millennials. There's 3 different ways to look at millennials depending on who you talk to, but we look at it from 1980 to about 2001. I do think that the millennials will break up into 2 groups of millennials. I think you're going to have a Gen Y1 and a Gen Y2, and it's that first decade, 1980. To 1990 will be very scarred, and they're definitely pessimistic and things like that because they can't. It's been harder for them to get a job mostly and income. But I think the second portion of that is that next decade will certainly, I think, be less scarred, let's hope, and that the market continues to thrive.
Mm-hmm. So Dowell, we've heard a little bit about delayed marriage rates and things like that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the linkage between these other milestones and buying a home. I mean, how tightly correlated are they? And to the extent that marriage rates or marriage decisions are being pushed back as opposed to not going to happen at all, which may also be the case. You may be seeing that preferences for marriage are going down. To what extent might that influence the shape of the housing market going forward?
Well, I think, first I'd say that I think Jason Furman did an excellent job for an economist of describing this long-term trend in marriage and how it was a precursor and it's a secular trend and it's not caused by the recession. It's a continuation. That was a good perspective to have. Having said that, we have a lot more people who are not married, who are partners, who are buying homes. Some of the strongest home buyers in America are gay couples. And so they will be married if they're not married already. But before being married, they're buying homes. And they're hetero couples also who are partners who are buying homes. My sister, who is a single woman, to my credit and discredit, I discouraged her from buying a house in 2003. I was scared. I said, you know, you only get one person. You don't have kids. You don't really need a house. She did it anyway. She made money. She reminds me about this. So she did okay. If she bought it in 2005, it would have been a disaster. So she's my sister. I had to protect her. She didn't need a house. For her, it was an investment. It was she wanted a capital asset. She wanted something to show for her money. She wanted the tax deduction. I think when people have earnings, they have those concerns. Right. What do I do with the money? And if you have a partner, then it's a shared project you take on, where it's an activity where it's a physical manifestation of your relationship, building something and investing in something. And I think that couples do that. And so with or without being married, they do that. And if you have kids, you want a place for the kids to live, and you want stability so you're not moving when the landlord tells you to move. There's lots of reasons why people would want to buy houses, for stability and for just showing that they're not kids anymore living in their parents' house, or they're not living in this singles neighborhood. Now, I just want to say one thing about the singles neighborhood. I'm with Tom. You know, the 1960s really were interesting and were shaped by the hippies and the like. But that was the first coming of the millennials, was the 1960s and 70s. When the baby boom generation hit the housing market, it created this explosion of revitalization in our cities and made the city living very attractive for the first time. We're seeing that again now with the millennials. The boomers, of course, then moved on to the suburbs. So the real question is, will the millennials move to the suburbs too? But for the time being, our cities are really enjoying an infusion because of the numbers of young people. This is upswelling of young people. It's very important for filling houses, filling apartments, and spurring new construction. And Tom's been feasting off of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, yes, actually, I would love to hear your thoughts about how millennials, or young people in general, not necessarily millennials, but how their preferences have changed for where they want to live, what they're looking for in a home. Are they looking for multifamily? Are they looking for single detached homes like their parents did? What's been changing, or what have you noticed? There's
no doubt that there has been this fascinating movement towards urbanized areas. I think of it as the Europeanization, I can barely say the word, but Europeanization of America. But when we talk about that, we all tend, I think, to immediately think of downtown Washington or downtown Manhattan. But my most successful new project, and we have a bunch of new projects, we have benefited from this, thankfully. But my most successful new project is in the suburbs. But it is in the in fact, my two most successful new projects are in the suburbs, but they're both in communities where assuming the person drives, when they get home, they never have to get in their car again. They can walk to the grocery store, they can walk, because they're part of a planned community with retail as part of it. So when I think about what this generation is going to want over time, and even though I'm in the apartment business, I'm a big believer in rentals. I don't think of my customers as being consigned to renting. I think over time, as they have children, they will move, but I don't think a large percentage of them are going to want to move to the suburban subdivision where you need a car to take your kids every place. They're going to move for schools, but they're going, and so I think the real future is in the suburban areas that revitalize and understand that density is a good thing, and that's what they ought to be encouraging, is further dense development.
And do you see that their preferences are shifting over time towards smaller places as well? I mean, you talked about the walkability aspect, right, and the not needing a car, but in terms of not having as much house to maintain, is that something that comes up? It's hard
to sort through what's an economic driver, and what's a values judgment or values driver. Clearly we are seeing our customers opt to accept smaller space in order to live in the location they want to live in.
So it's a trade-off. It's not a deliberate choice that they're making.
I think so. I think so. I don't know. I mean, but that's how I'm analyzing it. I see it as a trade-off that they're making because they want to live downtown, and in fact, the most significant change, and we've seen just in the past 2 years, is an increased demand for two-bedroom units because we've got more of our renters doubling up. In order to live downtown, in order to live in high-density locations, whether it's downtown Boston, downtown, or high-density suburban locations, they're accepting smaller spaces, and they're accepting spaces that they share with other people, even other unrelated people.
Well,
so
when you say that they're doubling up, you're talking about signing a longer-term lease with someone, or you're talking about more people going on to Airbnb and other home-sharing sites and things like that?
No, I mean that rather than take a one-bedroom unit at $1,700 a month, they'll rent a two-bedroom unit at $2,000 a month with another person. That's what I mean when I'm talking about doubling up.
Have you seen much of an increase in?
We've seen in our portfolio it was, if I remember the number right, because I looked at it at the end of the calendar year, it was a 10 to 12% increase across our portfolio on a year-to-year basis, which is not meaningless, I think.
Molly, how much do you worry about student debt holding back homeownership today and 10 years from now?
It's definitely a factor for sure. I think student debt, coupled with the fact that we have far fewer millennials that are actually employed, all of those things certainly are going to have a huge impact. And I think a lot of that is really pushing those young women and men actually from either going into even renting, let alone purchasing. We're definitely seeing that in our numbers as well. And so from the for sale side, so as Tom mentions, the folks that he's talking to on the rental side, on the for sale side, and this is not uncommon amongst all groups, is we're actually seeing they still want bigger. They still want, but more importantly, they do want the better locations, and they're willing to trade off bigger for better locations. But interestingly enough, the percentage that say they want urban, and to your point, I think they think of that as downtown Chicago or downtown San Francisco or downtown New York. We also see a larger percentage that really want to go to the inner suburban ring, and that's the 15 to 30 minutes out too. So, but debt, certainly income, what I can afford, all of that impacts what I can afford, how big that is, and how great of a location I can have, and can I have ownership, or can I in fact, or do I rent?
Can I interject? There's one other thing that we do see, and I expect this will ultimately trail over to the homeownership business, is while people are willing to compromise on space, they tend not to be wanting to compromise on features. This is a generation that never shared a bedroom with anybody. I mean, if you think about that, you know, you could write a book about that with that title. And so they want that, you know, they don't even know what Formica is. They want granite. They want, you know, high-end, when they turn the faucet on, they want to feel what they feel in their mother's house. And so I think that's an important factor as well.
I would agree with that, particularly on the rental side.
What other kinds of amenities are you thinking of? I mean, dishwashers? Or this was important to me when I left college. I wanted a place with a dishwasher, which was not always common.
Dishwashers, when I die, my epitaph will be is that he's the guy who brought washers and dryers to the first apartment projects on the East Coast.
So people want convenience.
People want washers and dryers in their apartments. You would no sooner build an apartment today without a washer and dryer than you'd build it without running water. And when I started in the business, I was the first one who did it in this area. So it's things like that that are just expectations.
And Tom, just to interject on that, I mean, I think the big thing that all people want, whether it's on the for sale side or the for rent side, it's anything that maximizes time and lifestyle. And so, you know, the washer and dryer, it's all about saving time so that I can actually spend my life where I want to spend it. And one of the biggest influences on the millennials that we're seeing is they really want to work to live, not live to work. And that has everything to do with what is happening inside the community, the features that you give them. I mean, it's entertainment things like the kitchen. They may not cook, but they want the kitchen to look good when their friends are over. And so that's where granite and stainless appliances and those special amenities become important. When you shift over to the for sale side and they're actually buying their first home, you have a larger percentage that say, I want to be able to choose and make this mine because I'm different. By the way, I'm different from everybody else. and they want to be able to personalize in the ownership world. But in the for rent side, on the for rent side, the other thing I would also note is there's a lot of competition, and it's how much I can afford and what my choices are, right? And so there are so many great choices, and design is really stepping up. And
not as much the cookie cutter apartment.
Right, and so, yes.
So, Dal, we've also seen major demographic shifts amongst generations of young people. Young people today, compared to young people in the past, are more likely to be non-white. They're more likely to be single parents if they're parents. How are those, they're more likely to be educated, as we've heard, or to have enrolled in school in any case, even if they didn't complete their degree. How have those other factors potentially influenced the way people think about where they want to live?
You know, I couldn't begin to answer that question because the diversity of the generation surely leads to a diversity of outlooks and diversity of preferences, and I can't know those. So I won't even pretend to say how that's changed. I think systematically from the data we can tell, though, that it has bifurcated the market in a sense that there's an advantaged sector and a disadvantaged sector, with the disadvantaged groups growing much more. And in the perspective of millennials, who is disadvantaged? Those are the ones who can't go to the bank of mom and dad. That's how I would define it in practical terms. Now that correlates with race to a large degree because the white parents have like $250,000, I think in their parents' age bracket, $250,000 in wealth. And for African Americans in the same bracket, it may be 20% of that. And so those parents can't help their kids as much. And so we have a choice here for government policy. Is it going to be relying on families helping themselves, which means that bank of mom and dad that only helps the non-Hispanic white group, or maybe the Asians might be helped that way too, or what about Latinos and blacks? So and basically we need to have everybody in the housing market because we really have a problem here with the aging baby boomers who I've written about who are going to be selling their houses, and they're counting on having good buyers, and the buyers are going to be millennials who are going to be prepared or not. Now, not millennials today, and I'm not selling my house today either, but 10 years from now, I will be selling, and I'll be selling to a grown-up millennial who is getting his start in the housing market today or her start today. And if they're not ready to move up to be a big-time buyer, I can't sell $1 million house to them. And of course, my house, I think, is worth $1 million. We all assume our houses are worth maybe twice as much or 30% more at least than what it really is. You need to have a strong home buyer segment, and that's the younger generation. And it's a diverse generation, and we're not cultivating it to its full capacity. We're just assuming it'll come along. I mean, I like the words of reassurance that we hear from different speakers. Like Jason Furman was very good, but it's reassuring, but it's sort of hoping it'll just come along naturally. And the diversity, I think, poses more challenges. We have to be more proactive. And I think that his ideas about student loan debt are good, and that we need to watch those closely in terms of the quality of the education people are getting. Because when people get a college degree, I looked at Latinos closely in California, and Latino with a BA degree definitely pays twice as much for my house as one with a high school degree. So I know who I want to have knocking on my door to get my house. And so it's really useful to think about the diversity and how to really make sure there's no lagging sectors. Everybody's up to speed.
Well, I was also thinking about the fact that Latino families are more likely to live in multi-generational households. For example, they're more likely to live with grandparents. Maybe there's less of a need to feel like I want to live on my own. I mean,
as is the Asian.
Pardon? And
as Asian, well.
Yes, exactly. Children of Asian immigrants.
Sure.
There are sort of cultural attitudes that you may have learned as children and you may continue to adopt as adults that might influence the way you think about your ideal living arrangement or acceptable living arrangement.
Well, let me speak to that, specifically looking at Latinos and African Americans. Totally different lifestyles. The Latinos live at home with their parents until they get married, until age 26. So they're not in the rental market. They're just not there. You're not building new apartments for Latino renters. They're just not there. They're living at home. African Americans are in the apartments. They're on their own early on. They don't, and it's a very different lifestyle. And so what happens, you have higher headship rates among African Americans. And there's an interesting little, I don't have time to go into it here, but you can look into this later, is that African Americans actually have higher homeownership rates than Asians do, for example. Asians, because they're living in multi-generationally, they're not counted as households because they're living with their parents until they're ready to buy a house. And then they leap into the housing market and buy. They're not renters, whereas African Americans are renters and owners. So it's just a statistical quirk. If you do it per capita, as a percentage of people, African Americans have a higher homeownership rate than Asians do in some age groups because they're not renting. I mean, because African Americans are renting and Asians are not renting. So there are those differences in it. Long traditions, and it's different for different Asian groups. Asians are all the same. Koreans and Chinese are different. So that's why I hate to generalize. I should confess I was an anthropologist at one time, so I'm sensitive to differences.
Well, but I'm also thinking about, if the composition of young people who are traditionally first-time homebuyer age has changed over time, to what extent might these kinds of persistent cultural preferences be influencing the numbers beyond, the economic constraints that we've already talked about, like student loan debt and high unemployment and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they do it in many different ways. It's not just one way that they make a difference. But I think it's safe to say that a uniform white model of the 1970s doesn't apply anymore.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing I'd like to interject is we look at the home shoppers that are out there across the country, that when you look at millennials specifically, they're 30% more likely to be ethnically diverse than actually when we look at the boomers. So the boomers are about 80% Caucasian, and those numbers drop dramatically. So not only, to your earlier point, they're not only far more diverse in life stage, you know, so we have the value of marriage and some of those things is also very different. But you also have just a huge diversity of ethnicity as well out there. And that does definitely, that could be a 6-hour presentation on what that means for housing and housing choices and things like that, to your point.
I'm curious to hear if you have noticed any difference in the way that the composition of young people has changed over time, and if that influences the way you market an apartment or the way that you make decisions about.
Sure. I mean, obviously.
Bedroom size or whatever else.
Not so much. It hasn't so much influenced how we design our properties. I'm not sure that we see among our renters that any significant differences in the characteristics of who's renting by ethnic group. And obviously, we're not allowed by law, nor would we in any attempt to quantify it. What I can tell you, and you know, I'll defer to Dowell's experience in statistics, but anecdotally, what I will tell you, both in terms of our employee base and in terms of what I see when I visit my properties, is we are extraordinarily diverse, both with Caucasians, African Americans, Latinos, and people from Europe and Asia. It may have to do with the fact that my rental properties, or my portfolio, is along the eastern seaboard, the northeastern seaboard. But I'll tell you, just a couple of years ago, we did a survey of our employees, and we had, in our company, we still don't have 2,000 employees in the company, and we had fewer than that at the time, but we had employees who were born in more than 52 different countries. And that wasn't just Latin American countries, it was European countries, it was Australia, it was the Asian countries. So, and they reflect our customers. So, you know, what we're seeing, what the statistics are saying are not necessarily in line. So, and yes, just to finish, answer your question, and I apologize. Yes, we have changed our marketing a little bit. Where we market is a little different. But so much of that is due to the change in these millennials. I mean, nobody reads the newspaper anymore. And, you know, I suspect, I don't know if, you know.
That's really true for the millennials, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we're not doing any post-advertising. I apologize, but we're not doing any post-advertising. We're doing a lot of online stuff with you all, and we're doing a lot of online stuff with Zillow and others. But it's all, I now have a workforce of social media people who do things don't ask me to explain it.
So I wanted to turn back to policy again. So there's this question of, to what extent should we be encouraging homeownership, given the low rates of return that it offers relative to a lot of other investments? Although obviously it offers a lot of other kind of benefits too, like the feeling of security and attachment to your community. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Molly, on what our goals should be in terms of, should we be encouraging more young people, well, first of all, to move out of their parents' basements? Or should we be saying, no, please save money, don't pay rent, don't go out and put down a down payment on a house, you know. So how do we think about weighing these different kinds of priorities, and what are the proper goals that government officials should be thinking about?
I want an opportunity to answer
Yes,
that.
okay.
I'll defer to Molly.
No, absolutely interject. You know, it's a loaded question, really, and I think for every individual, whether you're a millennial or not, I think it's dependent upon your income, your lifestyle, the things that are important to you, and I think the greatest commodity that people are looking for is time. But I also think there are other influences like family and all those other things that have an impact. I'll tell you from the research we've done, and again, it's largely predicated based on, I always have to underscore this, these are people that are out there actually looking at home ownership. But we've done a lot of attitudinal research, and of that research, you know, 91% of that millennial group says that home ownership is something that they strive for. 86% say that they don't want to rent, but at the same time, there are certain parts in your life and a lot of great reasons why that is the best alternative. So I don't know that we necessarily have to discourage one or the other or encourage one or the other, but I think we certainly should give them the vehicles to have that American dream, which is owning a home. And so from a policy standpoint, I think our major issues are giving them the loan vehicles to get there. I think we definitely have to address student debt and how that impacts. I mean, I have a huge family. We were talking about this last night, and I have you know, many of my older nieces and nephews that are frankly, you know, going to school to avoid paying their student loans. Now, it doesn't make a ton of sense because that debt continues to go up, but how do we actually encourage them, and what are the programs in place to support not only going into the workforce, but also to support them the way that, you know, in some cases, parents can help to support that down payment. But if you don't have that opportunity, how do we give them the support if home ownership is what they want when such a huge percentage associate, I think, that ownership with the American dream?
Mm-hmm. You wanted to weigh in.
Let me first say, in addition to building and developing and managing apartments and owning apartments, we also do some home building. Just so you know, I'm not totally biased. On the other hand, I will say that it is very hard for me as a citizen to justify that we have a housing policy that discriminates against poor people. We discriminate against anybody who rents.
Can you unpack what you mean by that?
If you look at where the greatest housing subsidy in America goes, it ain't to public housing or public housing recipients. It isn't to the recipients of various other forms of federal housing assistance. It's to those upper income people like me who maintain a mortgage solely to get the tax benefit associated with it. It's silly. It's illogical. I don't ever use the word fair because kids use that word and make it mean whatever it wants, but it is the single most unfair public policy anyone could imagine. So if we want to deal with debt, we should be giving our citizens the opportunity to have a balanced housing environment where they can make their own choice.
What would that mean in practical terms?
I expected to be booed.
What would that mean in practical terms? Would that mean more investment in public housing? Would that mean taxing owner-imputed rents?
You know, I'm a Democrat and I'm a libertarian at the same time, so I probably don't have a cogent answer to that question. I think, you know, you have to deal with reality, and reality says you can't do what I think is the right thing to do right away. But the one thing we ought to do right away is we need to reduce, in my opinion, the tax deduction to a very small. To only that percentage of the population who make under a certain income, and take it away from people like me who don't need it. I think that's silly. And yeah, I would take some of that savings, and I would put it into the housing tax credit program, so that we can provide some affordable housing. But there's no logic to encourage people to choose one form of housing over another. I was once sitting in a room like this dealing with this issue, and everybody in the room was realtors, and one of the realtors got up during a Q&A and said something about renters not being as, as good a citizen as homeowners. And so I asked who in the room rented, and obviously nobody had their hand up. And I said, who in the room rented at one time in their life or another? And everybody put their hand up. And I said, so let me understand this. You're a better citizen now that you have a mortgage than you were before you had the mortgage? I don't get it. And I think the bias still shows in the public commentary you hear on Capitol Hill or from the administration, unfortunately.
Well,
I think you want to weigh in. You look like you're itching to
a crack at the
say
policy
something.
issues. I'll support your idea that we should cap the mortgage interest deduction. People shouldn't be able to deduct interest beyond $500,000. How about that? It goes way beyond $500,000 now. But I think we should also target subsidy support where it's needed most. And the trouble is our tax code is all based on income groups. And that's not exactly the way to think about it. We're talking about millennials today, so now's a good time for me to raise my favorite housing policy, which is to target our subsidies to people under age 40. They're the people who struggle. People under age 40, the young adults, think of who they are. They are the people who are struggling to start their careers, and in the same time period are trying to have babies, which we are short of in America today, and in the same time period are trying to buy a house and get their housing career started, and are trying to get their wealth portfolio beginning. Now, if they start strong, they'll carry that forward into old age, and it'll be a nice retirement package, but they don't get a good start. Right now, the millennials are lagging. Now's the time of all times when we should really focus on jump-starting the younger generation. They should be getting the subsidy breaks, not people aged 55. And that's not how it's set up today. It is skewed towards higher income people who are later in their careers and already have a lot of assets they've already built, and they get more benefits. So it's target to young people under age 40.
The only thing I would challenge, and not, this is a whole different debate, is that we're living 20 years longer today, and I think there will be challenges with that 55-plus group, and the security and financial security is such a big deal for that group.
Agreed.
The only thing
I'm just thinking long term that if you can start a generation strong, the way we did with the previous generations, they'll carry that forward in time. And if you start weak, then what happens? They're going to end up weak, and we're going to really have a big problem.
Agreed.
And do you think that it's an appropriate policy objective to encourage home ownership amongst young people, or are you talking about helping them pay their rent or their mortgage?
Well, I think you should give people a choice, and you should give them counseling so they know what they're doing. It's not good for everybody. I could tell you, I already mentioned I tried to counsel my sister against it. It was good for her in the end, but it was just risky. The thing is, homeownership is the major way in which Americans build wealth.
Right.
It is the principal avenue we have, and it's because of the leverage principle that you make a down payment and then you get the appreciation on the entire product, and so it's leveraged investment, and that's why it's so important. There's no other good way people have. You can't put it in a savings bank today and gain anything. It just won't.
You could put it in an index fund.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You should do that too. You should have a diversified portfolio, half in homeownership.
Well, I think the other thing that with homeownership, you also can control what those expenses will be longer term, that potential of equity, and certainly paying that off. And so there are other parts of that will help them to build wealth. But I agree, I think, with all three of the things that we're saying, which is, I think the most important thing is they have to have the opportunity and the choice. And so if what's important to me is one thing versus another, I think they should have the opportunity, and we should build a foundation around those opportunities.
To what extent does financial literacy or financial illiteracy affect the way you think about some of these questions about whether people want to buy or want to own, and how, I mean, you've been in this business for a while. Are young people less informed today than previous cohorts, or more informed?
No, again, the people I'm exposed to are so bright. I'm inclined to say they're more informed. You know, I do believe, like Molly, I think that, and Del both, that this generation will buy homes. I hear it from, again, my employees, but I hear it from our customers too, that at some point, but the difference is that when you look at the generation of the 60s, and even the Gen Xers, we got married younger. These people are getting married, sort of there's a bell there that, they hear the bell, they know if they don't get married in the next year or two, they can't have a baby, or they can be sure of being able to have a baby, so let's find the nearest guy. Sorry, it's cynical, but it's probably true.
It's not quite that bad.
But I find what they learned, maybe this is going back to your first question, what they learned out of the recession is that they need to be cautious. That the medicine everybody was taking in 2005 and 6, that home ownership was necessary because it was the fastest way of getting rich, is silly, and maybe they don't even look at home ownership as an investment decision. They look at it as a lifestyle decision, which is how I think it should be looked at. I think realtors and the home building industry do a disservice to the customer and maybe to themselves by building the whole basis for home ownership around economics. I think the basis for home ownership is around lifestyle. Just as renting is a lifestyle choice, you want that flexibility and mobility when you're in your early 30s. When you're in your 40s and 50s and you're raising your kids, you want the stability of a neighborhood. And I think that's where the sales pitch is for home ownership. And I think it's a shame we in the home building industry don't recognize that.
Although I would argue that home ownership is not so much associated with stability these days, given what we've seen in terms of people losing their homes in the last few years. I mean, this was an anomaly of, the foreclosure rates that we saw were anomalous, but even so, you can imagine that it could have scared off people. When I was asking earlier about the scarring effects of the recession and the housing bust, I was thinking not only of personal experience,
sure,
and wrecking your own, getting your credit score wrecked and not being able to buy, but also sort of emotional scarring that you're seeing people have their homes lost and that sort of thing.
Sure, and I agree with what you're saying. I think the big thing is we definitely see lifestyle as a huge proponent, but again, it's all about priorities, right? And so it's the income I have, it's the responsibilities I have, it's what life stage I'm in, whether you're single, married, or not. And then it's the decisions that you make, and we use this term a lot in the real estate world, which is, you drive down highways until you find what you can afford based on the life stage that you're in and the price that you can afford. Everybody wants it all, though. I mean, everybody would love to have a fantastic life stage. They'd all like to have a 5,000 square foot house overlooking a fantastic amenity for $1. But at the end of the day, you're making those choices, and you're trading those off based on what you can afford. And whether that's for rent or for sale, I agree. From a financial standpoint, the one thing I'd like to add, I think there needs to be far more education about student loans and what that means once you graduate and what that payment's going to be than there is about simply getting a mortgage on a home. And I think it's a pretty easy, you can go on to Zillow or any of these great, fantastic websites, pop in the price and the interest rate, and there's your monthly payment. I don't know that they do that with student debt. I don't know that they realize at the end of, once I borrowed X amount of dollars, what that means for me and how long I'm going to actually have to pay that, because those are incremental loans that you're taking as you're going through school.
I'm not sure they understand what 7% interest means.
And how long. That's the continual feedback that I hear from the millennials is on their student debt, and the frustration is, I had no idea what I signed up for and what this meant.
Molly, what was that number you cited last night about the number of people who have over $250 a month payments?
Yeah, so there's actually 10 million people in the U.S. that actually
how many?
That owe 210 million people.
10 million.
Yes, and it's actually, and of that 1.2 trillion that was noted earlier, 30% of that debt is actually the 30 years and younger. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. So when you try to qualify for a mortgage, that will hold you back on what you can do.
And not only would the lender maybe be a little bit skeptical about lending to you to your heart's desire, but you may feel a bit of anxiety about taking on more debt given what you already owe. I mean, even if we were in a looser credit market,
even if you can get the mortgage, because in many cases that student loan is a mortgage payment for 10 years. You know, as you look at that, for some that don't, you know, have the parents that are paying for college, let alone the house that they're going to purchase.
So I think we are at the stage where we're going to open it up for questions. If people want to gather by the microphones. Yes.
Thanks very much. I wanted to go back to a point that Mr. Bizzuto and Dr. Myers made about the homes that baby boomers are living in the exurbs. So if you follow the logic that millennials are going to be more interested in the close-in suburbs and in the cities, but there's this big crop of housing out in the exurbs that are being occupied by folks who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s. What happens? Well, you know, this is about the longer term perspective on housing. What happens to those exurban communities if we think that the millennial population that's coming into the homeownership market is not interested in those homes?
That's a Tom question.
I'll let Del answer that question.
All right.
And I'd love to add something to that as well.
Well, that's a difficult question. One answer is immigrants, because large immigrant families seem to be congregating toward those houses. Another one is redeveloping the suburbs with more of a village-like center, with retail and apartments at the core being retrofitted in, and then that makes the whole community more attractive, I think. There's different ways to do it. What I've recommended in writing is we should keep the older folks living in those houses as long as possible.
I also think we need to understand, remind ourselves constantly that whenever you talk about a generation, you're really not talking about everybody in the generation, and there will be people who want to live in a single-family home as far out as they possibly can go. So, you know, it's the group we've been talking about. The people who want to live downtown are probably, you know, the influencers. But they're not necessarily the whole generation. Yeah.
And just to add a comment to that too, in the research that we've done, we actually have not found that with millennials per se. That there's a larger percentage of actually boomers that actually want to live downtown. Millennials actually say that they want urban, but close to 90% say they want single-family detached. When we ask them where they want to live in relationship to the central core, which is the first 15 minutes to employment, 15 minutes to 30 minutes, 30 minutes to 45 minutes, they most commonly want to live in that 15 minutes to 45 minutes. They're the least likely to want to go to a bedroom community, and that's definitely there, which is the 60 minutes or greater. But urban to them is being able to walk to Starbucks and being able to walk to different those retail places. So I would think walkable, but it still has a suburban appeal to it.
Hi, David Swift with Fannie Mae. I have a question about the influence or impact of single-family rental or single-family properties being purchased by investors to be run as rentals. Is that impacting first-time homebuyers' ability to enter the market? And do you see that as a long-term trend or just a sort of blip in the market after the giant REO gut that came through?
Good question. I can touch on that a little bit. I think the biggest issue I see with that is the investors are driving prices up. We are actually seeing that the investors are actually now sort of dropping in the market all of a sudden for the first time this year. But investor activity is greater than it was even in 2005. I think the biggest threat is the impact to home prices.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame the way it worked out. It makes sense, you know, business-wise, but those are great affordable opportunities for some young families to jump into and then ride the escalator up, but cash buyers took them all.
They did.
And you know, I helped my son with one of those cash purchases, so I know how it works. I think it was a one-time investment opportunity that won't be repeated like that. But they're still holding those, and they're going to sell them off now gradually. It has to be gradual, otherwise they'll crash the prices.
But at a higher price.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Francine. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I am a full-fledged millennial, and I am wondering what you all think will happen. Do you think there will be any development of affordable housing? More even like affordable apartments, because I am not considering moving into a home anytime soon. And I'm also not considering moving into an apartment anytime soon because I know for a fact I cannot afford an apartment.
I think if you look at, we haven't talked about that at all, and it's a great question. The demand, the need for affordable housing has grown, has continued to grow through the recession. The resources available to deal with it have not grown. You know, whether they're just not there, or I mean, that's why I think we ought to be using part of the mortgage deduction to fund that program or programs that meet that need. One thing I will say though is that when you look at the cost of housing, whether it's a single-family home or it's a rental property, something like 30% of that cost is directly attributable to government programs, government requirements that are, you know, whether it's zoning requirements, whether it's design requirements. And you can argue about whether they're necessary or not, whether they're additive or not. But the end result is they increase the cost of the housing. So the first thing, you know, the doctors say the first thing they do is do no evil or do no harm. I mean, one of the things we ought to look at with our housing policy, especially locally, frankly, is what things we do that increase the cost of housing, and then talk about how we make housing affordable.
I would comment on a couple of things. There is a new kind of housing that we're seeing come out, which I don't know if any of you are, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, which is apartments, which is, it's a much smaller sort of unit. It's actually super creative where it's a shared living room or family room, and then literally you're renting the room itself. That's a great affordable solution. And believe it or not, I mean, people sometimes have the thought process that, oh, that's going to be this really sort of different demographic and very poor people. Not at all. I mean, hip and cool, great. Seattle has a great few versions of those. But the other thing that we're seeing on the for sale side quite a bit, and the percentage and the number of people that want this, which there's a lot of multi-generational housing, or where you have, you know, a separate unit in the home that they'll either rent, and for the boomer, they look at it as financial security longer term. But I think there's a lot of, you know, families doubling up, but also giving you that independent lifestyle with a separate locked off suite and things like that. I think those things will happen. And then certainly there's a great need for affordable solutions, both for millennials and I think our aging boomers as well.
I'm John Como from HUD, and I have a question mostly directed to Tom. So there's been a lot of discussion about how student loan debt is impacting homeowners, but I'm wondering about the renter side. If you have people coming that want to rent apartments that have mounds of student loan debt, if you're having to reject applications because of that, or if people are doubling up because of that, or people are staying at home with parents?
I think, I'm not sure I can answer that. What I will tell you is the credit worthiness of our residents, as well as the income of our residents, maybe all this is not surprising, but over the past 4 years, both have gone up, and it may be that as people are choosing not to buy, they are the people who are renting are people with higher income and better credit, but as I ask at our properties what difficulties we're having and what about people we're having to reject, the student loan issue is not, has never come up as an issue for renting.
I would add one thing, and that is the number of 25 to 34-year-olds that are actually living at home with mom and dad. It's gone up by almost 30%. So there's something there, whether it's student loan or it's the fact that 700,000 fewer of them can actually find a job. I think it's multivariable.
Another question?
Yes, my name is Tony Mungrove from Century 21. I'm a realtor and an economist also. And I wonder why, I know we're speaking about millennials, but I think our aging boomers, like Molly was saying, they have a significant impact on housing, and they're not wanting to deal with the roof and this, everything falling apart around them.
Exactly right.
And so the rental market doesn't seem to target that group. They're just continuously targeting millennials, and so you find people who are struggling with income and employment paying high rents instead of low mortgages. It just seems to be a backwards. Is there any kind of, now that we are in a different time, is there any kind of shift with rental targeting?
I think one of the things that we're seeing in our apartment communities, and Dell and I were discussing this earlier, is that we're actually seeing some natural aging of our apartment renters. I mean, we're seeing more and more older customers renting from us. One of our new apartment properties, one of the ones I cited that was very successful, 40% of the renters were over 40 years old. Now, 40 is not by any means old, particularly from my vantage point, but it's you know, so I agree with you. Secondly, I think you will see, my industry is like every other industry, we're lemmings, and I think we're all seeing the market rate business getting very competitive, and we see what you see, and I predict within 5 years, you will see half a dozen at least companies, at least a half a dozen companies around the country that are trying to build to that need.
I agree. And we are actually seeing quite a, I mean, I spend a lot of time on the active adult world. I'm seeing a lot of activity in that space, both for rent and for sale.
Yes.
Alejandro Becerra with the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. You mentioned the problem of student debt. The New York Times just ran a major article last weekend on the growing problem of subprime car lending and the influence that it's having. Have you had a chance to look at it, at this problem?
So it's, none of us has, right? Let me, you know, car lending, what does that have to do with housing? Well, it can be a torpedo that will just sink your housing ship. I think subprime is a place where you need to have a lot more literacy and financial counseling in general. It could be a good, I took a subprime loan at one point, but I was really careful about it, and I had a spreadsheet that tracked out worst case. Most people aren't doing that.
I'm a lot like that.
I would venture to guess no.
You're not doing that. So subprime is very worrisome. Can I just venture another thing we haven't discussed, which is reverse annuity mortgages, which are a nice solution for older people who've got a lot of equity, and they basically, they sign a contract to get it's like an annuity stream that comes back to them. And I've talked to people who counsel older people, and they won't go near counseling about reverse annuity mortgages. They won't touch them because they've seen too many cases of abuse. It's like the subprime car loan or subprime house loan. You know, it's a good concept, but then there's some, you know, entrepreneurs who are opportunistic and they take advantage of it, and then it discredits the whole industry. And we really have a problem. We don't know how to regulate this. We don't know how to supervise. And there's too much predatory lending that goes on. That's what led to a lot of the worst abuses in the bubble, was a predatory component. And we were just trying to spread opportunity originally, but it got out of control. So I don't know how you supervise that.
I think there has to be far more education about that, because I've done enough research on that to be dangerous. They feel like you're stealing the only wealth they have, which is their equity, and they feel that that is their financial security, yet it's a vehicle to give them more financial security, and they don't understand that completely. And their children are in fear that, you know, that's a whole different issue.
And it's really tricky.
So sure, yeah.
One more question. Energy costs. Obviously, that's becoming a huge issue in Philadelphia. Rent doesn't mean just the rent. You're paying the water bill, you're taking care of everything in the house. It's crazy the way rent is in Philadelphia. So now kids that are younger that are looking for rent aren't really getting the benefit of being a renter because they're taking on homeowners, and now people are investing or just paying the taxes and that's it. So now there's more of a shift for investors to buy and do the rehab, and I think that what the elderly people that we see that are going to go into the rental market, we're going to also see, like I bought my first house at 23 because I wanted to use it to pay off my student loan. Got beat up by the mortgage market, so it didn't really work out the way I had planned, but this next generation are smart that way. They're asking for duplexes and they want to own it now while they're, you know, learning and earning at the same time. And energy costs are a big deal.
Sure.
And so because we want to see more solar powered things, and what impact do you think that the cost of the alternative energy and building these new developments with alternative energy is going to have on the housing market, and how these kids are going to be able to afford to get in on that and do it early?
Any quick responses to this, because we're out of time?
I don't have one.
So I'll do a quick one on that. So obviously there's a lot of new development. UC Davis is a great example of that, where they're doing net zero apartments, and so they're trying to get those energy costs down. The challenge that I find is a lot of time that technology is so expensive that it still impacts the rent. And so and if I'm saving you your $250 a month in energy, your rent tends to go up $250. And so, you know, you're robbing Paul to pay Peter. You know, it's all a balance of what the developer has to spend on land, the cost to actually build it, and then how they can actually make this to be, you know, something more than a nonprofit. I mean,
so tax benefit for the developers.
I'll add one quick, again, anecdote. I always make the people in my office build our apartments with gas because they're more energy efficient. When I go out and talk to my leasing people, our renters are renting because we have gas, but it has nothing to do with economic efficiency. They like the gas range.
for sure.
So
Particularly the Asian population.
I don't think the customer is as focused as you are on the utility costs.
Yeah.
But they are focused on monthly expense for sure.
It's huge in Philadelphia.
For sure.
All right, well, thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you for letting us be here.
Thank you very, very much, Catherine, Tom, Molly, and Dowell. Before we go to break, we're just going to look briefly at the results of our polls. So in 5 years, the most important housing issue will be, I view this as a bit of a vindication of Jason Furman's presentation. So apparently changing housing preferences will not be a significant housing issue in 5 years. So millennials have not fundamentally changed whether they think about buying versus renting. And home price volatility will not be the most significant issue. Again, home values will be kind of boring over the next couple of years. The biggest issue 5 years from now will be access to financing, and most importantly, affordability, something that we've been discussing quite a bit. In 5 years, the median age of millennial home buyers will be the smallest cohort here, the 11%, is the youngest part of millennials, age 28 to 31. And so what this really says, again, what this panel and what Jason's data said, which is people are getting married later, they're staying in school longer, they're buying homes even later. And so the largest cohort here actually is the middle part of the millennial generation. And in 5 years, the home ownership rate will be lower, lower than 65%. That's what half the room thinks. And only a small portion of the room thinks that the home ownership rate will actually be higher than it is today. So this data is up on Twitter under the hashtag HousingFuture. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and thank you very, very much to our esteemed panel.